Welcome to Bold Agendas, a series of thought leadership podcasts dedicated to the discussion of transformation management. In each podcast, we dive into topics of strategic interest to business leaders who are driving their organizations through transformative change. Today, we're tackling one of the most critical challenges in business, preparing for the future in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. As leaders face rapid technological innovation, shifting global dynamics, and emerging societal trends, the ability to anticipate and adapt has never been more important. To explore this transformative idea, I'm thrilled to welcome Frank Diana, a futurist and managing partner at Tata Consulting Services. Frank is a recognized thought leader and advisor on the future of business, and he's passionate about helping organizations navigate the forces shaping tomorrow. Known for his concept of rehearsing the future, Frank challenges leaders to go beyond simple predictions by imagining possible scenarios and preparing for the opportunities and disruptions they may bring. I'm Mimi Brooks, the CEO of Logical Design Solutions, a business strategy and transformation consultancy, and I'm a leadership coach. Today, we'll unpack Frank's key insights for 2025, and we'll discuss how leaders can build adaptability and resilience and explore actionable strategies for thriving in an uncertain world. So this is Bold Agendas with futurist Frank Diana on rehearsing the year ahead. Let's get started. Frank, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I'm thrilled to have you.
Oh, thanks for having me. Good to reconnect.
It really is. So, Frank, I think that you were one of the first futurists that I ever met and spoke with and had a chance to do some industry talks and marketing work with. So it's a delight to have you here. And as I was saying to you when we were speaking beforehand, I think that not all futurists necessarily do the same work, although I imagine that you have some, common themes to how you work in methodology. But let me give you the floor for a few minutes so that you can tell folks, what you do, Frank, who you do it for, and what maybe a day in the life looks like of a futurist.
Sure. Well, thanks for the opportunity to do that. I am, as mentioned, a futurist. I am the principal futurist at Tata Consultancy Services, which means I spend all of my time, as you might imagine, thinking about the future. What many people don't realize is I spend as much time thinking about the past. I'm sure we'll get into some of that, as history is really instructive in terms of where things may go. So it's a fascinating time to be one, given what's going on in the world. And most of my day is spent, if not constantly trying to understand our world, it's really kind of communicating that understanding to audiences around the world, whether it's forums or C-suite customers or board directors. It's really what I do every day. It's fascinating.
And you have a team of folks that work with you too at Tata, right, Frank? So you've got, as you said, you're the principal futurist, but it's a team of people that do this research and thought leadership for Tata.
Yeah. So a small team, some futurists, mostly storytellers, people that are really good at communicating complex messages in easy to digest ways. So visualization is a really big piece of what we do. And then, of course, people that can have a breadth of vision, being able to see multiple things at once, because that's really what our world really it calls for today.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, Frank, when I asked you to come on to the show, there's a million things that we could have talked to you about, but as you know, we're shooting this at the very end of 2024, and I asked you to come on to kick off a series that I'm doing on, how we think about what's likely ahead of business leaders in 2025. So the year ahead, given some of the lessons learned and change that we experienced in the last year, how might we think about some of the big issues and opportunities that could sit ahead of us in 2025? And perhaps, as you and I were saying, even beyond that, as we think about the second half of this decade, the beginning of the end here in terms of the 2020s and what could be unfolding, over the next 4 or 5 years or so. So, thanks for kicking off this, a look ahead into the future as part of the discussion. I think you're a perfect person to do this with me.
Well, again, happy to be able to do that. I think these things are important because leaders everywhere really need to be thinking about these things.
Yeah. Part of my inspiration for this, Frank, was an article that you wrote that ran just a few weeks ago that was advocating for rehearsing the future, the year ahead in 2025, rehearsing, versus predicting the future. And there was a lot of good ideas in that article, maybe a bit of a framework of how to think about, rehearsing potential scenarios, for next year. So can we start with just the concept, Frank, of, why you describe this rehearsing idea as the better, way to envision the future as opposed to, thinking about predicting the future?
Yeah, and that's a great place to start. And it starts with the notion that we as humans have really never been that good at prediction. I'm sure there'll be people out there that will dispute that point, but it's fact. If you look historically, we're not really that good at it, especially in times of high degrees of uncertainty. And some would argue that we've always been in uncertain times, but there are periods in history that have represented much more uncertainty than traditional times, and this is one of them. So to think that we could, with some degree of certainty, predict the future, I just think is impossible, which leaves us with this notion of rehearsing. It's a play on scenario planning and scenario analysis that companies like Shell have been doing for years. But it's a function of understanding the elements of rehearsal, the things that we need to focus on to do justice to rehearsing. And I think one of the key challenges for every leader out there today is just the number of domains involved in this rehearsal, a number of domains that find themselves in a state of flux, which is why I believe this period is different than our last 70 years, quite honestly, because there are geopolitics, the economies of the world, society, science, technology, environment, philosophy. Those are the 7 key domains that I focus on that really are all in a state of flux. And we can get into some of the details. But how do you rehearse when there are so many forces at play across all those domains? And it's not easy, but that's why I think it's imperative.
So, Frank, this is a way, in a macro sense, this is a way to think about how we anticipate risk, manage risk, think about it before it's upon us. As an approach, it's probably an approach that builds adaptability and resilience into leadership decision making, as we think less about, a hardly set strategy and plan for the next 5 to 10 years, right? So as a matter of strategic execution, we need an approach that by its very nature is adaptable and flexible. That's the concept here that we're talking about, right?
Yeah, well, and your use of the term strategic plan is very appropriate, given that I think the definition of one has changed considerably in light of the fact that 3 to 5 years, it's anybody's guess what happens in that time frame. So anybody, my belief, anybody that thinks of a 3 to 5 year plan will hold is really kidding themselves because they just don't anymore. And so, how do you then create a living strategic plan that evolves with you, evolves with the times, evolves with the changes that we expect in the world? And a lot of this is not easy, and it pushes against traditional ways of doing things, right? Which I find to be the biggest challenge for any leader out there is getting past the status quo, getting past what we've done in the past approaches, and allowing themselves to think about this world a little bit differently.
That was one of my questions, Frank, is how do we make sure that what we're not doing is scenario planning, against kind of the current state and considering an incremental change strategy, if you will, versus a transformative change. So when we think about the framework itself, if we are modeling different scenarios, where does the strategy and vision fit into the framework, if you will? Like, how do we account for that, Frank, beyond the scenario planning events themselves?
Yeah, well, it starts with a mindset shift, which as humans is always the hardest thing for us to do. So, if one of the questions I constantly get from leaders is, how do we stay focused on the here and now, but at the same time allow ourselves to move us forward into a possible set of futures, defined as some rehearsal that you do, right? But this lacking a compelling reason for boards or C-suites to accept that the world is likely to look differently. Lacking that compelling reason, we just tend towards that status quo, just keep doing what we've been doing. And that's the question that people always ask me. How do we create that compelling reason to focus on these different futures? And that's why I said storytelling is a big part of what my team does, because if you can tell effective stories that compel a leader to think about this world differently and to give them reasons why, likely in 2 to 3 years, your business changes considerably. And if we're anchored in the here and now, we're not building towards the possibilities that emerge. So it starts with the mindset shift, allowing your belief systems to change to some degree, and then allowing your strategies to be living strategies informed by rehearsal. And because they're living, not set in a specific strategy, understanding that it's likely to change and I'm going to have to pivot along the way, right? But if you're not consciously thinking about those scenarios, there's no opportunity to pivot, right? You can't have a living document. And again, it's the hardest thing for leaders to do.
What about, Frank, combining this idea of scenario planning with other methodologies that are particularly good for, future solving versus problem solving? So, for example, the right to left motion of backcasting. So, where is it that we want to be as opposed to where are we today and how do we want to fix it? Where do we want to be? And then right to left, what would have to be true in order for us to get there? So if I combine something like, systemic design or backcasting with scenario planning, then that says, if that's the stake in the ground, and as you said, it's a movable stake, right? Based on lessons learned and events that unfold, et cetera, and then I think about scenario planning in that context. How do you feel about what I'm saying, Frank? Like, how would you think about that?
So if I were to look at this front to back, left to right, however we want to think about this, the foresight piece of the story, which is what you just articulated, right, starts with foresight. So that you've got a vision in terms of what the possibilities look like. From those possibilities, scenarios emerge. And I'll walk through the rest of the cycle, but let's stop there for a second and use an example. As you might imagine, one of the key challenges that the world faces is demographically, an aging society, less children, less workers, which has many people thinking about what does retirement look like in the future. So I've had a number of financial institutions ask us, what does the world of post-retirement look like in the future? So before you can scenario plan, you've got to have at least a vision of what that could look like in the future. What does retirement mean? Can you retire? If you do retire, are the social programs enough to sustain you over time? Are you living in a world where you're constantly relearning and retraining yourself so you can stay active in a world of work, and mechanisms that emerge will allow us to do that? But you have to have that first foresight kind of exercise to look at possibilities. Then in the context of your world, your business, what are the scenarios that emerge from that vision of what retirement could look like? And then it flows to the process of ideation and thinking through what we do to move us forward into that world incrementally. And I only use the word incrementally because you want to do things that create some value in here and now, but position you for that potential view of the world as it emerges. And then it's the execution, the agile, the piloting of POCs that we have to work the whole process through, right? So foresight through ideation, through execution, with scenario planning being a part of that process.
So, Frank, I want to go into the elements, the themes that you've identified for 25. But before I do that, just a quick question. In the perspective that you are describing, is there really no kind of logical distinguishing done between short-term planning and long-term planning? In other words, as both a futurist and using the process that you describe, do we see those two ideas, together, more than we see them apart, such that time itself, what short-term versus what long-term, is less of a big distinguishing factor in planning?
Well, I hope we get to that place because, again, back to what I said earlier, these time horizons that we've been very used to are collapsing. So if we're thinking that we're innovating around something that is here and now, that's fine, and most companies do that. But if we're thinking, well, this is 5 years out, so I'm not going to concern myself with this right now, and it's an overriding way people think. It's too far out for me to worry about. So if you pull time horizons forward, if you get people to appreciate that what this scenario represents could be happening next year or the year after, that compelling reason for action starts to emerge. In the absence of it, we are human, so we just think it's too far out for me. Somebody else will worry about it. So that collapsing of timeframes, as you just described, is critical. And innovation, all my time I spend with leaders as they try to ideate and innovate, you find that, and we have a process that does this. What horizon is this idea going to support? And the bulk of the ideas are in Horizon 1, which is here and now. Right. I just did an exercise. It was fascinating with a leadership team where they had to think about their future in 5 years and what might be different. And it was dominated by just AI making something they do easier, right? There was no perspective on what that world might look like that looks very different than your current business model.
Yeah.
Right? And so you can see, and then of course an exercise where we then overlay on top of that, but what if these things happen? And then perspectives start to change, right? But if you leave people to their own devices, and this is not a criticism, it's who we are as humans. We have an experience base. We've done what we've done for a long time in most cases, in most organizations. And it's just very hard to look up and start thinking a little differently about your world unless forced, right? Unless you get an exercise. And then those exercises sort of end when the day's over. And it doesn't kind of end up being part of your strategy, part of the planning process. So you kind of lose the momentum that you started, which is unfortunate as you look at these workshops.
I wonder, Frank, just pontificating that for a moment, I wonder if this isn't at least one of the real applied values in the ecosystem structure, right? Because it kind of forces us to think about the system together holistically versus the system in its parts. Because I think that when you put parts and short-term planning together or near-term planning, you really get these incremental improvements in pieces of the system and this lack of recognition that the system really does evolve and move together as a whole. And if you're not really factoring that right, you're going to miss these important relationship ideas. Yeah. Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, as you know, I've been a proponent of ecosystems for several years now, and the notion that the possibility space is so large that no one company, no one industry is going to solve the grand challenges of society. It's going to take an ecosystem, a community of stakeholders that come together to help solve these problems, which means the way value is created and captured changes. But talk about bumping up against traditional ways of thinking, right? If you have a competitive mindset, if you just think about partners through a certain lens, then stakeholders, which are part of the process of creating and capturing value in win-win kind of relationships, is very different than how we're traditionally used to thinking about that. So it has not evolved, this ecosystem model, as quickly as I thought it would because of these underlying obstacles, if you will. But to your point, when used correctly, it's a learning platform. Now your diversity of thought, the ability to get the learnings from such a diverse audience expands. And as our learning expands, our capacity to think about the future, our capacity to create a future expands with it. But again, it comes up against humans and how they're accustomed to thinking about it. So just one example. I had a conversation way back when around an energy ecosystem that involved the car, the home, obviously energy. So an expanding ecosystem that kind of fed each other in the context of energy. And the player that was looking to create this ecosystem and the platform that supports the ecosystem was thinking about owning it, value chain kind of thinking versus bringing the players, insurance was going to be part of that ecosystem, bringing the players in that will create this ecosystem, right? And with me was the CEO of an insurance company. And offline, he said to me, why on earth would anybody want to create such a complex business model like insurance, capital intensive, as opposed to just bringing in the right stakeholder? And this was several years ago. At the time I said, play the long game. The model can't survive. So eventually there's no choice but to embrace this phenomena of ecosystem. But again, it's taken longer than I thought.
Yeah, you know what's funny about it too, Frank, is that you need a structure, and then I'm going to get into the framework itself, but you need a structure like an ecosystem to explain the network effect of exponential value creation, right? I mean, the value creation that's exponential doesn't come by taking the same model and just trying to juice it a little faster. That's not exponential, that's incremental. So you need something that brings in this network effect, right, in order to have the new value creation
Yeah.
that we're talking about.
It will happen. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm not into prediction, as I told you, but this one I'm fairly certain about because the possibility space is so large. Consider synthetic biology and quantum computing and AI and humanoid robots, and I can go on and on and on. Right? As those things continue their path, the opportunities they represent are massive. The problems we can solve. I show a lot of videos of a bionic arm that now the brain is moving, right? You can see where we can take these things. But again, one player can't do it. So it naturally evolves to these places. I just can't predict on what timeline.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, Frank, let's talk about the framework itself. These kind of 7 themes that you think are going to be relevant ideas as we think about rehearsing the future going into next year and some of these opportunity and risk scenarios that could be material to us depending on how the world plays out.
Yep. So when I did a lot of research on history, as I mentioned, I just find it to be one of the best signals I can find in terms of times that look like these in the past and what happened, and then learning from that and hopefully avoiding the same mistakes we made back then. So, for example, in a lot of my work, 2 periods in history look very similar to ours. One is the 1800s, the early 1800s, when, remember the Luddite movement and automation being a big piece of what was happening back then. People don't remember or know that there were 40 years of human misery that followed that automation, 1800 to 1840, because society didn't move fast enough to deal with the downside of the technology movement. That was one period. The second, which is problematic, is the 1920s. We look exactly like the 1920s. So when I show an audience the characteristics of that era and ask them to find something that doesn't exist again today, nobody can do that because we look exactly like the 1920s. So if you consider those things, then there are lessons there to be learned. And unfortunately, humans don't do this very well. But so starting this conversation around what did history tell me, these periods had something in common. And I use the term convergence to represent that. They had so many domains in a state of flux, and the forces were converging in ways that you couldn't predict. But in hindsight, you can see how the world was formed, at least our current world. So, for example, I mentioned the domains of geopolitics, society, economy, etc. Every one of them has a series of forces at play that when you look at them in the macro level, it's just overwhelming. It's impossible for anybody to see how those things might converge in ways that shape these possibilities. So if we talked 4 years ago about a possible World War III, I'm sure most people would think we were crazy, right? Geopolitical tensions, the reserve currency status of the US dollar. I can go on and on and on. And so we capture these forces in a model. And using the model, exercises with leaders that actually pull some of these forces together, show how they might combine, and in so doing, represent a possibility, right? So if these things combine, aging society, the geopolitical tensions of the de-dollarization movement, you just pick a bunch of these things and tell the story. And this has been very effective because it's, again, hard to grasp all this stuff, right? So the approach, the frame, is one of convergence, identifying forces that span these domains, and then doing justice to the stories that you can tell in terms of how they might come together to shape the world. We have found it very effective, but it's not easy. So let me pause there for your thoughts and I can expand upon that.
Well, that makes sense to me, Frank. So I feel like what you're kind of bundling together are some of these elements that you talk about, like, shifting systems and global dynamics. I feel like that's one. Convergence as a driving force. I think that's another. Societal transformation, what's happening there and how that affects us. So all those, make good sense to me that we would be thinking about, the energy space, the economic space, the geopolitical space, the issues with society, certainly environment, all, kind of acting on each other under different sets of circumstances, right, Frank, and creating headwinds, tailwinds to whatever the business, view of the future might be, or what they're hoping to shape, right? So whatever that is. How about, Frank, these two concepts that are a little bit different than that, that are the issue around dealing with these dual edges that I just want you to take a moment and talk about, and then I'm going to have you go from there to this expanded possibility set. So dual edges first, like how do you see that as a theme?
So again, historical precedents here. Whenever we've been in periods where I use the word innovation, but I've increasingly been using the word invention, and I do it for a reason. Periods where we're actually creating new innovation leverages invention, right? And so in history, we've been through several periods where invention was the dominant form as opposed to innovation. And I think we're in one of those periods. So if you think about history, whenever we're in periods like this, there's always two paths. One is the constructive benefit society path, one diminishes it. And so you have to understand both sides of that story. You have the optimists that overthink the constructive side and downplay the destructive side. You have the pessimists that are all focused on the destructive side, don't want to move too fast on the constructive side, and both of those are flawed. So the challenge for society is, how do we manage this dual path in ways that allows us to realize the benefit, mitigates the risk of the unintended consequences? Not easy to do. And in the past, I'll go back to history again, the time in our most recent history where we did this very well, post-World War II, when it was clear to society that this can't happen again. These kind of world wars that we just experienced can't happen again. And the institutions of our day were formed back then. And they've been very effective. They're flawed, but they've been very effective because we've never been back to the world that existed in the 1940s since. So we know we have the capacity as humans to manage this dual path. The nuclear Cold War issue is another good example of how we didn't allow that to take the mutually destructive path. So that dual path requires a societal focus. It's global in nature because every issue that we can talk about is global, whether it's climate change or AI's path, etc. So global focus on these dual paths is required. And if I'm a pessimist in any way, it's the lack of willingness to do this globally, right? Fragmentation in policy, fragmentation in regulation, fragmentation in the institutions we build will not solve these problems.
So, Frank, can we stay there for just one sec? Because I think that these dual edges can weigh heavily on business leaders' minds in terms of, how to think about best next steps. And I'm going to call them, best next steps that are balancing good for the business with good for people, good profit, whatever analogy, you might want to use there. And there's a lot that could come into view even in 25, right, as we think about AI maturing quickly and concerns that, people have, other futurists have, in terms of whether we start staring down AGI and we, go or we don't go. Is that a real threat, or is it overblown at this point, et cetera? So these dual edges, seem to be issues, ethical issues and business growth issues that will weigh pretty heavily on, business leaders' minds, I think, in the next few years. And they'll probably need to lead here, the stakeholder that's going to have to lead around some of these issues. How do you see that playing out, Frank? Like, what do you hear from business leaders here? How are they thinking through this? How are you advising them?
Well, I mean, all that underscores this need for rehearsal, right? Because we can't possibly understand the dual edges unless we understand where these things may take us. And so this is a struggle because historically the focus in both places, the today, the here and now, the quarterly result, the shareholder view of the world is a dominant view, whether we like it or not, right? And so we relied upon to focus there, and obviously that's not going to change. The last several years have had somewhat of a purpose kind of orientation to some of the dialogue. The ESG discussion, which we can spend hours on, were glimmers of hope in terms of focusing in both places, right? Yes, profit's important. Yes, returning to our shareholders is important, but so is realizing some of the gains that this world now represents. So it's a struggle at every level. This guardrail conversation around AI. How do we do it in a way that allows us to gain the value from AI, but also mitigate the risk? And those are ongoing discussions. I don't know that I've come across a great, solution to this problem just yet, because I think it's still work in progress as far as people trying to make some sense out of all this. The use case focus that I see today around AI doesn't help, because we can get into a lot of long conversation here, but the use case focus historically, when you have a new technology like this, is efficiency oriented, profit, productivity oriented, as it should be. Um, and then you don't see enough ROI at the onset. So in some places you squash it, so that the dual side of this coin, the positive side, doesn't move, because you don't see a traditional metric like ROI being realized, right? So I don't know that I have a good answer to the ethics part of this, because whose ethics?
Yeah.
Whose
What's the
morals?
definition of a
Yeah,
good future, right? What
yeah,
what what is that definition even? Yeah. Yeah.
exactly.
Did you find that, Frank? I know that you just came back from meeting with 200 clients in Sydney. Did you find that was a top of mind discussion with those folks, Frank, or would you say there were other things that came out, much louder than that, if you will?
Well, it was definitely dominated, as most discussions are these days, by AI, in that conversation. But I have to say, in places like Australia, where energy is a very big piece of their portfolio, if you will, a lot of energy conversation, very focused on sustainability and climate change. And it varies across the world based on where you are, the degree at which people focus on sustainability and climate change and energy. But that was a big topic of conversation in Sydney as well. But the notion of how to advance AI, which was discussed in ways that mitigate risk, like this notion that if you train these models on data that represents human values, is probably the safest path forward to deal with the ethics and morals conversation that we're having here. But the challenge is, again, whose human values? There's no global standard for that, right? There are cultural differences. There are all kinds of differences that we have to appreciate and respect. So there is really no easy answer here. It was Jeffrey Hinton, I was telling you offline, at one of our summits, that basically said exactly that. He believes that if we don't find a way to infuse human values into this AI path, that we're going to run into some problems. So open questions, open issues, no good answers yet.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to watch this discussion as we go into next year. I imagine that we'll start, hitting some of these issues in real practical ways. So right, let me move us to kind of a practical view of the framework then, in terms of how we work with leadership teams, in developing these forward-looking strategies where we anticipate risk while we're trying to build, resilience and optionality, if you will, into the business model. So how does it work, Frank? How does it literally work, when you're talking to business teams or leadership teams, and they're trying to figure out how to get from here to there?
So I have a visual that I use that's very effective to do this. It's a figure eight, intentionally, because you want to convey a message of it's a constant process. It's not linear. It's never over. And along the figure eight on the left side is the foresight piece of the story, as we talked about earlier, where you're looking at possible futures. You're trying to assess through these signals where the world may be going. And then it evolves into the scenario planning piece of the process. And the themes that emerge from that scenario planning are fed into your strategies, your visions, which is really the left side. In the middle is an innovation portfolio. And so it's spawned by the left side process. And that innovation portfolio, living, breathing document, which basically captures how you believe you're going to manifest what came out of the left side of the discussion. Again, pivoting, changing as things change. You might come up with three different things you might want to pursue. You weight one because you think it's more practical or probable, and you start down that path, but then something changes and you say the second one might be more reasonable, so you shift. So that portfolio then feeds the execution side of the story, which is the agile, rapid way to get to value. And it's a circuit that just is constant, right? And so you're always feeding back and forth across that figure eight, and it's worked really well in terms of getting people to conceptualize how to do this. There's times where people just want to ideate and they don't want to do the foresight piece. Just come in and help us, work through the ideation piece of this. There's times when they want just to rapidly move to pilots, but my team doesn't get involved in those things. I manage the entire process, right? So foresight is clearly what we do well. So that's the approach. It's effective in terms of getting people to buy into trying to do some of those things, but never easy.
How do you deal with walking into situations, Frank, where we really are pursuing optimization versus new value creation? How do you reset that?
Yeah, it's always hard. Again, real term, near term kinds of value creation is always what people are grasping for. And I've been there, you're there, we know the drill. So that's not surprising. The storytelling piece of this is the only thing I have found to be compelling enough to shift a mindset. And that is your near term value creation is going to be offset by destruction, and that's not some scare tactic. It's true. The destruction is coming in terms of elements of your business that are no longer viable or tenable or sustainable given what's coming. So that near-term focus undermines you eventually, and that eventually that timeline is collapsing. So how then do you do both? Secure value in the near term in ways that build you toward the future that you envision. Sometimes they're separate and distinct, but a lot of times you can connect those dots. And we actually visualize some of this. A Horizon One initiative that is creating or supporting a Horizon 2 initiative that drives Horizon 3, right? So if you connect those things visually, you help leaders see that what you're doing today is positioning you for tomorrow. And these other things are strictly here and now kinds of things that you're driving. And of course, some of those things have to be done, whether it's customer experience oriented or efficiency or profit oriented, employee experience. All those things are important. But you have to help people connect those dots. And short of that, it's hard for mindsets to shift.
What do you think is critical, Frank, in going from the planning process to, I'll call it sustainable execution? How do we get into execution? What becomes critical there that might be new systems, processes, models that I didn't have to use before that are now in the critical path of running these strategies as real programs?
Yeah, let me answer that by starting with an analogy that's working really well. AI will ultimately be viewed as a general purpose technology, much like the steam engine, much like the printing press and electricity. And electricity being the closest one to our historical time here. That story resonates with people. When you show them how it evolved from replacing the steam engine, all else remained the same, to motors being embedded in machines, and now they could be organized in a better workflow, separated from the central shaft, to ultimately completely changing the system, the factory system completely changed. That took 40 years. And part of the reasons it took 40 years is that, one, you needed structures like wires and generation plants and physical things that had to be built before you can fully realize the benefit of electricity. But two more important factors, which play really well into what we're experiencing now. One, it took a new generation of leaders to realize electricity for what it was capable of, not viewing it in the context of what we already do and already know. And then two, it required a complete rethink of process, because the process as it was really didn't fit very well with what electricity was capable of doing. So two very big things that in a lessons learned capacity, we should be learning from. Digital structures are not as necessary as the physical structure, or not as much of them. We need data. We need a number of things, IoT, a number of things that are physical, but it's not as complex as the physical world was. But the process innovation, leaders that start thinking about the capability of these emerging technologies, rather than stuck in how we do things, that's critical. And I still see a lot of that mentality out there. So to your point, process could be an enabler, but right now it's an inhibitor.
what about other, Frank, organizational systems and structures or norms that can either be inhibitors or anti-patterns to the business models that we're trying to run, or others that perhaps you see as promising accelerators?
Well, most of them today are more inhibitor than an accelerator because we're
Yeah.
still kind of stuck in a hierarchy, command and control kind of business, organizational operating model, if you will. Um, and again, really hard for people to decentralize, to allow decision making to happen at the point of engagement. I like to think about, and much like ecosystems, but thinking about this for years, a sense and respond paradigm, which in a sense says in a world that moves as fast, in a world that's this uncertain, so much change, you have to sense signals in real time, as close to real time as possible. And then you have to actuate, you have to respond in the right ways. And so if we think about the future, simulation, digital twins, approaches that allow us to sense and understand that when these signals emerge, here's how we're going to respond. That's so critical to operating in a world that looks like ours, and that's so anti command and control hierarchy, right? And there's a business, I'm not sure if you're familiar with them in China, called Haier, Haier.
No, I'm not familiar.
So they have embraced this model. They have 4,000 plus entities that are their own P&Ls, that they're pursuing an ecosystem opportunity on their own, get funding from the core mothership if necessary, go out and get VC funding if they think is necessary, and then they use capacity from Haier where necessary. They contract for it. And so they've already proven that this sort of model is the future. But it is kind of opposite of what most leaders out there are accustomed to. So our current models are in our way. There are signs of new models. Look it up if you're interested, because it's a fascinating case
Yeah, I
study.
will.
Um,
Frank, what do you see with our frontline workers, with workers in terms of readiness, and if there are, headwinds there or barriers to change there that seem to be repeating
yeah.
from your experience?
So in a lot of the historical work that I've done, several quotes have just popped up, and I use them in my presentations, where history tells us that humans are a very stubborn species and resistant to change, and not news, mind you, unless forced. And the other side of that quote is, but extremely versatile at change when we're forced. That World War II, post-World War II story is a good example of that. So humans being who we are, we don't unlearn very well. And which is critical in our times. We have to unlearn because we have to forget what we know, which doesn't apply to where we're going, right? And so at the human level, at the employee level, there's a lot of that resistance to change that still exists today. And if you think about a lot of businesses, especially the ones I talk to, the average age is in the mid 40s in these businesses, right? So you've got people that have been in place for a very long time. I've had leaders say, come and speak to us because the employee base is stuck, and we just need new perspectives for folks to start thinking about. And so I do believe that employees and human nature is what it is, and there's going to be a challenge to getting folks to really think about some of this differently. Other side of that coin is diversity in thought, whether it's cultural diversity, whether it's younger generations coming into a business with different ways of doing things. And then their challenge is, if they think differently, they come up against that status quo, and then they get frustrated because they basically are questioning, why are we doing it this way? And then they get pushed back because we've always done it this way, right? So I think there's two sides, there's two forces at play in terms of the employee base. There's emerging thoughts conflicting with entrenched positions, and how that plays out, I think, is going to be very instructive.
Frank, I also see sometimes, I'm wondering if you do as well, that we haven't always done a good job in explaining to our workers, particularly those that can be physically far away from corporate or the epicenter, of the kind of power base of the business. So our frontline workers, people in the field, et cetera, challenging work environments in terms of engaging them, where the idea of the new value creation that we need from workers isn't clear to them relative to how they fit into our business models going forward? How can I be really successful there and find this win-win of my interest, my purpose, to the interest and purpose of the organization? Have you seen that, Frank?
Yeah, definitely, especially with younger generations, in terms of their focus on purpose, their focus on really just different way of thinking about what they want out of work in the future. I mean, that's a challenging set of discussions that are happening today in terms, especially Gen Z. But that being said, how we communicate and how we storytell, whether it's outward or inward, I just think it's critically important. Getting people to buy into a vision, um, a purpose, and being more explicit about our purpose, right? I just think those things are critically important in our world today. And it doesn't help that the environment we find ourselves in is so polarized that you actually get pushback against what was positive progress towards more of a purpose orientation, if you will, et cetera. So you've got conflicting, I don't know, conflicting messaging happening. That doesn't help us here.
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of funny to me, Frankie. I spend a lot of my time here in terms of organizational systems and structures. As we think about our post-industrial age business models, and the transformation that we need to go through with those, there's probably nothing more industrial age than our organizational systems and structures, our hierarchies, our definition of leaders. The difficulty in assembling and leading fluid cross-functional teams, et cetera. It just seems to me that one of the things we're going to have to take on over the next few years is the redesign of our organizational systems and structures so they work for us a lot better than, being the anti-pattern, to progress. Your
Spot,
thoughts?
again, I think there's examples of businesses that are doing this very well, and only a few though. But I think they're ahead of their time, and it represents a model for the future. I firmly believe that. But structures and new approaches only go so far. It's the human mind that is going to be the obstacle if we can't get people to think differently. And of course, history tells us this as well, right? It always takes something, some catalyst, to force humans to change their behaviors. And we're not getting into a lot of depth here. Unfortunately, history tells us that it's usually some form of catastrophe that drives that change in philosophy. And I do believe that philosophical change is on the horizon. There's so many forces at work that will force us into that. The question of when and how effectively we can manage that philosophical change. But it's structure, yes, but I think a lot of this is rooted in the human mind.
Yeah, and in human systems, right? New relationships, forging new relationships, new ways of interacting. Yeah. And I know, Frank, before I move on, just in case you wanted to say something about this concept of developing learning as a capability, learning, unlearning, relearning. I think that's a epicenter kind of message of yours as well, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this notion of learning, relearning, unlearning, famous Alvin, what was his name? One of the famous futurists, his quote, I really like that quote, that the people that get ahead in the 21st century are those that can do all those things, not just learn, relearn, but also unlearn. The unlearn piece, because of what we've been saying about the human mind, is very challenging for us. I show a really impactful video of somebody that has tried to get people to ride a bicycle on stage 10 feet for $200. And to this day, nobody's been able to do it. And the reason is the engineers just changed the bike. If you turn left, it goes right. And if you turn right, it goes left. Nobody can do it because the rigidity that sets in once we've learned something, it just sets in, right? So it's a good example of that. So how does one unlearn or at least have the mental model in place that says I should try to unlearn is critical. But in the context of business, failing fast, allowing ourselves to fail, those are really good buzzwords, but they're important. And culturally, few businesses are good at that. But if you don't allow yourself to fail, learn from the failures, and then actually take those learnings and infuse them into the business. I had a meeting a couple weeks ago in Virginia, and the conversation was about, we think we do learning okay, we just don't use it, right? So it's okay to learn, but if you don't allow yourself to take those learnings and impact aspects of your business, then it's all for naught. So anyway, return on learning, I think, is a metric that should get much more attention and eventually maybe be more important than ROI, especially in a world that looks like this.
So, Frank, as I go to wrap this up, I'm going to bring us back to where we started in terms of the new year ahead, and just want to give you some time to pontificate a bit of, what's top of mind to you as you think about, crossing into our new year. Maybe the things that you're optimistic about, things you're worried about, or what you're hopeful and kind of seeing next year. How are you thinking about it?
Well, from a hopeful perspective, I really do see that this possibility space, and by definition, possibility means opportunity and challenge, right? It's both. So the possibility space is as broad as I think the world's ever seen it. Maybe a provocative statement, but I really do see that because of so many things that are converging on the sciences, technology, and across the globe. So what makes me very positive is the capacity for humans to solve some of the challenges that have been with us since we've been on this planet, is as high as it's ever been. Um, but so is the potential for downside, whether it's automated warfare, the cyber risks that we all hear about, and so many other things that can happen by biological warfare. All those things exist in the context of this possibility space. So how much we move forward in 2025, and I do think we're going to move forward fairly rapidly, in ways that enable both sides of those dual edges, is the focal point, right? Because that nothing else really matters if some of these things play out. And on the pessimist side, it goes back to that global will to address what are a lot of global challenges. Without that global will, it's going to be hard to put the guardrails around a number of these things. And so those are the things that I focus on both sides of this discussion, right? Positive, negative, and how the world evolves in about a year or two. I really do think that by 2026, if we were to have this conversation again, we're to look a lot different.
So, Frank, how will you keep your finger on the pulse, going into this year? What are your strategies for keeping up?
Wow. Because of the overwhelming number of signals that fly at us these days, especially if you're spending all your time focusing on them, it is a really challenging thing to do, because you have to. And one of the things that I would impress upon leaders everywhere is if you get good or are good at one thing, systems thinking is that one thing. The ability to see the system as opposed to just the piece parts is so critically important today. And in order to see the system, all these signals matter. And so, how do you keep pace with all the geopolitical things that are happening today? How do you keep pace at economics and how economics might change in light of all the things we've talked about, right? Society is such a big piece of this story because we're at a place where society is changing significantly. All of these things, science, technology, environment, philosophy, they're all a source of signals that I have to, and my team has to stay really abreast of. And you do that through all kinds of channels, right? I read like on nonstop. It's just one of the things you have to do. So nonstop reading, nonstop checking the news, all the things that are out there today. And then even, in our business, we get exposure with a lot of customers and what they're thinking about, right? So it's invaluable to have a number of industries in dialogue with you that are thinking about something in a certain way, right? Those are signals in and of themselves. So all of that, it contributes to sort of a constant movement of our thinking, and how do you infuse that into how we talk about this to the market?
I like your idea on prioritizing thinking in systems and systemic design, Frank. I think that's in some ways, it's almost a way to deal with the complexity, right? Because if you do think about it systemically, you see all the interrelationships that could be there and are there today. In my opinion, it's a way of dealing with complexity than to see them as individual pieces that
Yeah.
aren't connected to the whole. Like how else do you reason about it then? So I think it's also a funny way of dealing with complexity at the same time.
I agree. And if you go back to what I said about these technologies ultimately change the system, So if you system level change is the last spot on that evolutionary path, and AI is going to take us there. So will quantums, all these things that we can talk about, the science, they're going to take us there. So if you come in with the mindset that at some point, and the consensus opinion is 15 years, by 2040, the systems of our world have completely changed. And that's the economic systems, the geopolitical systems. What if the nation state as the concept goes away? That's a what if question that could actually happen, right? So if you don't start at that system level, which requires systems thinking, then you're constantly behind. You're constantly behind.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. I really like it against the, just to bring us back to the beginning, I like it going against the scenario planning, because I think it's the what view that we can say, what if, happens. So it does create a stake in the ground, even if, that stake's going to have to be, fluid to move around as the world moves on. So,
and those what ifs are impactful because they help you envision what might be before you ever get into scenario planning, right? You think about what might be.
Exactly.
What ifs is a great mechanism for that.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. Well, it's great to see you, Mr. Diana, as always, and I appreciate you spending some time with us right before the holidays. So gracious of you to let us drag you into the studio with us a week before Christmas here.
Well, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I look forward to, I would like to do this about this time next year, if that's okay, and come back and talk to you about what did we learn. I imagine, as you say, that it'll be a pretty different situation than what we're talking about here.
It'll be a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, as always. Okay, Frank, listen, thank you again, and have a great holiday with your family, and I hope to see you in 25.
And likewise, thanks.